Hello everyone. Looking back, the signs were there long before I ever noticed them. Small things at first, too small to raise any real suspicion. A change in her schedule here, a vague explanation there. Nothing that seemed out of place on its own. But when you line them all up, piece by piece, the picture becomes impossible to ignore. It's like standing too close to a painting. You don't see the whole image until you step back and look at the bigger picture. And by the time I did, the cracks in our marriage were already too deep to ignore. Her name is Lauren. We met 9 years ago, back when life still felt simple. I was just starting my career, still figuring out who I wanted to be. She was the kind of woman who could walk into a room and instantly draw every eye without even trying, confident, charming, with a smile that could disarm anyone. I fell fast and hard, swept up in the whirlwind of her energy. When we got married after 3 years of dating, I thought I'd found my forever. We built a life together, shared dreams, inside jokes, all the little moments that add up to something more, but somewhere along the way, things started to change. It wasn't sudden, not at first. It was more like a slow shift, so gradual that I didn't notice it happening until it was too late. She started spending more time on her phone, quick glances at the screen, a faint smile she didn't bother to explain. The late nights began soon after, work meetings that ran longer than expected, last-minute dinners with friends whose names I never heard before. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her so badly. But the longer it went on, the harder it became to ignore the sinking feeling in my chest every time she walked out the door. It wasn't just the schedule changes either. It was the way she started pulling away, little by little. Conversations that used to flow easily now felt strained, as if she was holding something back. Her laughter, once so effortless, became more guarded, like she was afraid I might hear something she didn't mean to say. And the intimacy between us, the moments that had once come so naturally, began to fade into something distant and unfamiliar. I told myself it was just a phase, that the stress of work and life was weighing on both of us. But deep down, a part of me knew there was more to it than that. The first real red flag came late one night, months after the changes had begun. I had fallen asleep alone, the faint hum of the television filling the empty space beside me. When I woke up, the clock read 2:14 a.m., and the spot where Lauren should have been was still cold. I found her downstairs, standing by the kitchen window with her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was low, urgent, but I couldn't make out the words. I stood there in the doorway, heart pounding in my chest as I listened to the muffled fragments of her conversation. When she turned and saw me, her eyes widened with a flash of something that looked a lot like guilt before she quickly masked it with a smile. "Just a work call," she said, slipping the phone into her pocket as if that explained everything. But the tightness in her voice and the way she avoided my gaze told me all I needed to know. That I didn't confront her that night. Maybe I should have. Maybe if I had asked the right questions, things would have turned out differently. But fear held me back, the fear of hearing the truth I wasn't ready to face. So instead, I turned away, pretending that I hadn't seen the cracks spreading through the foundation of our marriage. But the doubt wouldn't go away. It clung to me like a weight I couldn't shake, growing heavier with each passing day. I started noticing more and more little things that didn't add up. The way she would tense up when her phone buzzed, the faint scent of cologne that clung to her clothes when she came home late, the way she seemed to avoid my touch as if the distance between us had become too great to bridge. And then there was the name. I heard it for the first time one night when she thought I wasn't listening, just a single word, spoken too softly to catch at first. But once I heard it, I couldn't forget it. Daniel, the name echoed in my mind, refusing to be ignored. I didn't know who he was or what connection he had to my wife, but something about the way she said it made my blood run cold. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but the picture they formed was one I didn't want to see. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that the stress and fear of losing the woman I loved were making me see shadows where there were none. But the doubt wouldn't go away. It whispered to me in the quiet moments, filling my mind with questions that had no answers. And then, one night, everything changed. It was late past midnight when I woke to the sound of Lauren's phone vibrating on the nightstand. She stirred beside me but didn't wake as I reached for the device, the faint glow of the screen illuminating the darkness. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stared at the name that flashed across the screen, Daniel. I hesitated for only a moment before swiping the screen, my hands shaking as I unlocked the phone. The messages were their lines of text that told a story I hadn't wanted to believe. Flirty comments, inside jokes, late-night conversations that stretched into the early hours. But it was the last message that hit me like a punch to the gut. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. The room seemed to tilt beneath me as I stared at the words, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But there was no denying the truth. The woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted with my heart, had been lying to me. And now, there was no escaping the reality of what she had done. I sat there in the darkness, the phone still clutched in my hand as the weight of betrayal settled over me like a suffocating blanket. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else as the world seemed to narrow to the screen in front of me. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the messages, each line another blow to the fragile hope I had clung to for so long. And as the minutes dragged by, one thought echoed through my mind with relentless clarity: nothing would ever be the same again. I sat there for what felt like hours, the glow of Lauren's phone casting faint shadows across the bedroom walls. The messages blurred together as I scrolled through them, each line digging deeper into the hollow ache that had taken root in my chest. My breath felt shallow, my pulse hammering in my ears as the words echoed in my mind: last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. I read it over and over, as if repetition might somehow change the meaning. But it didn't. The truth was there in black and white, undeniable and irreversible. I should have put the phone down. I should have stopped reading before the images started forming in my mind, images of Lauren with a man I had never met, sharing moments I had no right to see. But I couldn't stop myself. My fingers moved on their own, scrolling through weeks of late-night conversations, each message another thread in the web of lies she had spun around me. There were jokes and shared memories, casual mentions of places they had gone together, places I had never known she visited, and then there were the photos. Not explicit, but intimate in a way that made my stomach twist. A selfie taken in what looked like a hotel room, her smile soft and relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in months. Another photo of Daniel, tall, dark-haired, with the kind of easy confidence that seemed to radiate from the screen. His arm draped casually over Lauren's shoulder, their heads tilted close together. They looked like a couple. Not two people sneaking around in secret, but two people who belonged together. The air in the room felt too thick, pressing against my chest as if the walls themselves were closing in. My hands trembled as I set the phone back on the nightstand, my fingers clenching into fists to stop the shaking. My mind raced through every possibility, searching for some explanation that didn't lead to the conclusion I already knew was true. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe there was some innocent reason for the messages, for the photos. But no matter how hard I tried to twist the evidence into something else, the truth stared back at me, cold and unyielding. Lauren stirred beside me, shifting beneath the blankets with a soft sigh. For a moment, I froze, afraid that she would wake and catch me in the act of discovering her betrayal. But she only turned onto her side, her breathing evening out as she slipped back into sleep. I sat there, staring at the faint rise and fall of her shoulders, and felt a surge of emotions so tangled I could barely separate them. Anger, betrayal, sorrow, they all twisted together into something heavy and suffocating that I couldn't stay in that room. The air felt too thick, the walls too close. Moving carefully so as not to wake her, I slipped out of bed and made my way downstairs, my footsteps silent against the wooden floor. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the clock were the only sounds as I stood in the darkened kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter as if it could anchor me to something solid. My mind wouldn't stop replaying the messages, the inside jokes, the late-night confessions, the plans for future meetings. Each word felt like a knife twisting deeper, cutting through the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, I had been wrong. But I wasn't. The evidence was right there, undeniable and unchangeable, Daniel. The name echoed in my mind like a broken record. I didn't know much about him, but what little I had gathered from the messages was enough to paint a rough picture. He was someone from Lauren's past, a classmate she had known years ago, back before we had met. They had reconnected recently, though the messages didn't say how. Maybe it had started innocently enough, two old friends catching up after years apart. But somewhere along the way, the lines had blurred. The late-night conversations had turned into something more, and the casual meetings had become secret rendezvous that neither of them had any intention of ending. I tried to remember if Lauren had ever mentioned him before, some offhand comment about an old friend, a passing reference to a name that hadn't seemed important at the time. But if she had, I couldn't recall it. Maybe she had never planned to tell me. Maybe she had always intended to keep this part of her life hidden, tucked away where I would never find it. But now that I knew, there was no going back. I didn't know how long I stood there in the kitchen, my thoughts chasing themselves in endless circles. The clock on the wall marked the slow passage of time, each tick a reminder that the world outside continued to move forward, indifferent to the turmoil that had taken root inside me. Eventually, exhaustion began to seep into my bones, dragging at my limbs with the weight of too many unanswered questions. But sleep felt impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the messages, the photos, the undeniable evidence of everything I had lost. When dawn began to creep through the curtains, painting the kitchen in soft gray light, I knew I couldn't avoid the confrontation that lay ahead. The truth was out now, and no matter how much it hurt, I couldn't pretend that nothing had changed. I had to know the full extent of what had happened, the how, the why, the moments that had led Lauren to choose someone else over the life we had built together. I took a deep breath, the air cold against my lungs as I tried to steady the whirlwind of emotions inside me. My pulse pounded in my ears as I imagined the conversation that awaited me, the questions I would ask, the answers she might give. Would she deny it, try to twist the truth into something easier to swallow? Or would she admit everything with the same defiance that had begun to creep into her voice whenever I asked where she had been? I didn't know. And that uncertainty was almost worse than the betrayal itself. By the time I heard footsteps upstairs, followed by the faint creak of the bedroom door opening, my mind had settled into a cold, clear focus. The shock of discovery had begun to fade, replaced by a resolve that felt like steel in my chest. I had spent too long ignoring the signs, too long convincing myself that everything was fine. But now that I knew the truth, there was no more room for doubt. As Lauren's footsteps approached the kitchen, I straightened, my hands tightening into fists at my sides. The air between us seemed to shift the moment she stepped into the room, as if the weight of what I knew had already begun to seep into the space between us. Her eyes met mine, and for a split second, I thought I saw something flicker in her gaze, uncertainty, maybe, or the faintest trace of guilt. But if it was there, she hid it quickly, masking it behind the same smile she had used so many times before. But this time, it wouldn't be enough, because no matter what lies she tried to tell, no matter what excuses she tried to offer, the truth was already etched into every word she had shared with him. And now that I had seen it, there was no going back, nothing would ever be the same again. The air felt heavier as she stepped into the kitchen. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for what came next. My pulse pounded in my chest, but beneath the rush of adrenaline, a cold clarity had settled over my thoughts. The doubt that had clung to me for so long was gone, replaced by the hard certainty of what I had seen. There was no more room for questions, no more space for excuses. The truth had rooted itself in my mind, and now it demanded to be faced. Every breath felt deliberate as I stood there, watching her move through the space we had shared for so many years. The small routines that had once defined our mornings, her reaching for the coffee pot, the soft clink of mugs against the counter, the faint hum of the refrigerator felt distant now, echoes of a life that had begun to slip through my fingers long before I realized it was happening. Each sound seemed amplified against the silence that stretched between us, the unspoken weight of what I knew pressing against my chest. My thoughts circled around the images that had burned themselves into my memory. The messages, the photos, the name that had become a constant refrain in my mind: Daniel. Every detail replayed with relentless precision, each line of text another nail in the coffin of what I had believed our marriage to be. There was no erasing what I had seen, no way to unsee the evidence of her betrayal. But standing there in the kitchen, the distance between us measured in footsteps and heartbeats, I realized that knowing the truth was only the beginning. What came next would shape everything that followed. My gaze followed her as she moved through the room, each motion imbued with a familiarity that now felt like a lie. I noticed the way her shoulders squared, the faint tension in the line of her jaw, as if she could sense the shift in the air. Maybe she could feel the weight of my stare, or maybe it was the subtle change in my posture, the way my hands gripped the edge of the counter a little too tightly, the way my breath came just a little too shallow. I could still hear the faint buzz of her phone in my mind, the name flashing on the screen as if mocking me from the shadows of the night. Daniel. A man who had been nothing more than a stranger until he had slipped into the cracks of our marriage, weaving himself into the spaces where trust had once held firm. I thought of the messages, inside jokes that spoke of shared moments I hadn't been part of, casual mentions of meetings that had taken place beyond the edges of my awareness. And I thought of that final message, the one that had shattered any remaining illusion that this could be explained away. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. The words echoed in my mind like a bell tolling the end of something I had once believed unbreakable. The images that accompanied them were harder to push aside: the photo of Lauren, her smile soft in a way I hadn't seen in months, her eyes holding a warmth that no longer belonged to me. The image of Daniel, arm draped casually over her shoulder, their heads tilted close together in a pose that spoke of a connection deeper than words could convey. Beneath the rush of emotions that swirled through me: anger, sorrow, disbelief, there was a question that I couldn't shake. How long? How long had this been happening? How long had she been meeting him in stolen moments, exchanging messages that carried the weight of secrets she had chosen not to share? How many nights had she slipped out of our home, leaving behind the man who had trusted her without question, to seek comfort in the arms of someone else? The answers wouldn't change what had happened, but the question still burned in my mind, demanding to be asked, even though I knew the answers would only deepen the ache that had settled in my chest. I thought of the late nights when she had come home hours after she should have, her excuses vague and her smile just a little too forced. I thought of the moments when her phone had buzzed with messages she was quick to dismiss, the faint flicker of guilt in her eyes gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Each memory slotted into place like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known I was assembling until now, and yet, beneath the anger and betrayal, another thought gnawed at the edges of my mind: the question of why. What had driven her to this? Had it been something I had done or failed to do? Had the love we had once shared faded without me noticing, replaced by a longing for something I couldn't provide? Or had it always been there, buried beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to break free? The thought twisted like a knife in my chest, sharp and relentless. I had spent years building a life with her, believing that the foundation of our marriage was strong enough to withstand anything. But standing there in the kitchen, the distance between us now measured in more than just footsteps, I couldn't escape the truth that had settled into my bones. The woman I had trusted with my heart had made a choice, one that had shattered the foundation we had built together. And no matter how much I wanted to understand why, the answers wouldn't change the fact that the damage had already been done. Time seemed to stretch as the silence between us grew heavier, each second a reminder of everything that had shifted between the moment I discovered the messages and the moment she stepped into this room. My pulse drummed steadily beneath my skin, but beneath the rush of adrenaline, a strange sense of calm had settled over me, a clarity born from the realization that there was no going back. The confrontation had already begun, even if the words had yet to be spoken. Her gaze met mine, and for a moment, something flickered in her eyes: uncertainty, perhaps, or the faintest trace of recognition that the unspoken truths between us had finally come to light. But whatever she saw in my expression, she didn't look away. And as the silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid, I knew that the moment of reckoning had arrived. I stood a little straighter, the tension in my shoulders easing as if the weight of doubt had finally begun to lift. The questions I had carried for so long no longer mattered, not in the face of the truth that had been laid bare. What mattered now was the choice that lay ahead, the decision that would shape the future I had once believed would always include her. But as I stood there, the echoes of her betrayal still fresh in my mind, one thought rose above the rest with unshakable clarity: nothing would ever be the same again. The hours that followed felt like moving through a world stripped of color, each moment heavy with the weight of what I now knew. My mind wouldn't stop replaying the images, the messages, the photos, the undeniable proof that the woman I had trusted more than anyone else had chosen someone else. Each detail carved itself deeper into my memory, refusing to fade no matter how much I wished it would. There was no escaping the truth now. It had settled into my bones, a constant ache that I couldn't shake. The confrontation had unfolded without words, but the silence between us had spoken volumes. The look in her eyes when our gazes met, the faint tension that pulled at her shoulders, the way her hands had tightened around her coffee mug as if bracing for what she knew was coming, it all told me what I needed to know. And yet, the questions still swirled through my mind, relentless and unforgiving. Why? How long? Was it my fault? Each question echoed in the hollow space where trust had once lived, leaving behind only the sharp edges of doubt and betrayal. That I moved through the day in a haze, each moment marked by the weight of emotions I couldn't fully untangle. Anger burned beneath my skin, sharp and raw, but it was the sorrow that cut the deepest, the realization that the life I had built with Lauren was no longer what I thought it was. Every memory we had shared, every moment of laughter and love, now felt tainted by the knowledge of what she had done. I couldn't look at her without seeing the messages, without hearing the echo of Daniel's name in the back of my mind. The questions I had tried to push aside for so long now demanded answers, each one pressing against the walls of my mind with relentless force. How had it started? Had it been a chance encounter that reignited something from her past, or had she sought him out, driven by some need I hadn't been able to fulfill? I thought of the messages, the easy familiarity in their words, the inside jokes that spoke of a connection that had grown deeper than I wanted to admit. And I wondered how many nights she had spent with him, how many moments of intimacy they had shared while I waited at home, unaware of the cracks forming beneath my feet. Guilt tangled itself with the anger and sorrow, a thread that I couldn't fully untangle from the rest. I couldn't help but wonder if I had driven her to this, if the long hours at work, the missed date nights, and the moments of distance had created a void that she had sought to fill with someone else. Had I become so focused on building a future for us that I had neglected the present? The thought twisted like a knife in my chest, sharp and unrelenting. But no matter how much I questioned my own role in what had happened, I couldn't ignore the choice she had made, the decision to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. The house felt different now, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of what had been revealed. Every room seemed to echo with memories that no longer felt like my own, the laughter that had once filled the kitchen, the quiet moments we had shared on the couch, the warmth of her presence beside me at night. Each memory clashed with the images that now haunted me, turning what had once been a place of comfort into a space filled with shadows I couldn't escape. Nightfall brought no relief. The silence of the house pressed against my chest, heavy and suffocating. The faint creak of the floorboards as Lauren moved through the rooms upstairs sounded louder than it should have, each step a reminder of the distance that now separated us. I sat alone in the living room, the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the clock the only sounds in the stillness. My thoughts chased themselves in endless circles, each one leading back to the same question: what do I do now? Part of me wanted to confront her, to demand answers to the questions that burned in my mind. I wanted to hear her say the words out loud, to force her to acknowledge the choices she had made and the damage they had caused. But another part of me hesitated, unsure if I could bear to hear the answers I knew she would give. No explanation could undo what had happened, and no apology could erase the images that now haunted my thoughts. As the hours dragged on, exhaustion began to seep into my bones, but sleep felt like an impossible dream. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with him, their laughter, their stolen moments, the intimacy they had shared while I waited in the dark. The ache in my chest grew heavier with each passing minute, until it felt as though the weight of it might crush me beneath its force. Eventually, I rose from the couch and made my way upstairs, my footsteps slow and heavy against the wooden floor. The hallway stretched before me, each step echoing in the silence as I approached the bedroom we had shared for so many years. The door stood slightly ajar, the faint glow of the bedside lamp spilling into the hallway. I hesitated in the doorway, my gaze falling on the familiar shape of Lauren beneath the blankets, her breathing slow and steady in the stillness of the room. For a moment, I stood there, torn between the life we had built and the betrayal that now stood between us. The memories of our years together flickered through my mind, the laughter, the shared dreams, the moments of warmth that had once seemed unbreakable. But those memories clashed with the images that had burned themselves into my mind, turning what had once been a source of comfort into a reminder of what had been lost. That I stepped back, closing the door with a quiet finality that echoed in the silence of the hallway. My footsteps carried me to the guest room at the end of the hall, the space that had once been reserved for visitors now becoming a refuge from the storm that had taken root within my home. The air felt colder here, the walls bare and unfamiliar, but the distance from Lauren was a relief I hadn't known I needed until that moment. As I lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling with eyes that refused to close, one thought echoed through my mind with relentless clarity: nothing will ever be the same again. The following days passed in a haze, each moment weighed down by the knowledge that had settled deep into my bones. Time seemed to move differently now, each hour stretching longer than the last, as if the universe itself had slowed to mirror the heaviness that pressed against my chest. The silence within the house was suffocating, thick with the unspoken truths that hung between Lauren and me like a wall neither of us dared to breach. She moved through the rooms with the same ease as always, her footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors as if nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, the air crackled with the tension of everything we both knew but refused to say. The questions I had carried in the aftermath of my discovery still echoed through my mind, each one another thread in the tangled web of emotions that now defined my days. How long had it been going on? Had it started with a chance encounter, a moment of nostalgia that had spiraled into something neither of them had intended? Or had it been deliberate from the start, a conscious choice to seek out the thrill of the forbidden, knowing full well the cost it would exact? The answers wouldn't change what had happened, but the need to understand clung to me like a weight I couldn't shake. That I moved through my days on autopilot, each task a distraction from the thoughts that lurked just beneath the surface. Work offered a temporary escape, the familiar rhythm of deadlines and meetings pulling me into a world where the weight of betrayal couldn't reach me. But even there, the memories lingered, slipping into the quiet moments between tasks: the image of Lauren's phone glowing in the dark, the name that had become a constant refrain in my mind. Daniel. A stranger who had somehow become a part of my life without my knowledge, weaving himself into the cracks of my marriage until there was no longer any way to ignore his presence. Nights were harder. The distance between us was most palpable in the stillness of the house after dark, when the hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the floorboards were the only sounds that broke the silence. Lauren slept in the master bedroom, while I lay awake in the guest room, the unfamiliar mattress beneath me a stark reminder of the divide that had grown between us. Sleep came in fragments, brief moments of restless dreams interrupted by the echo of words I couldn't forget. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. Each time the memory resurfaced, it hit like a blow to the chest, stealing the breath from my lungs with the force of its finality. I tried to imagine what had led her to that moment, the choices, the justifications, the moments of hesitation that she must have pushed aside. Had she thought of me when she sent those messages, when she stood beside him with that smile that no longer belonged to me? Had there been a moment when she considered turning back, when the weight of what she was risking had threatened to pull her under? Or had the thrill of the forbidden drowned out any thought of the life we had built together? The questions circled endlessly, each one cutting deeper than the last. But beneath the anger and sorrow, a quieter realization had begun to take root, one that I hadn't been ready to face until now. No matter how much I wanted to understand, no matter how many answers I sought, the truth was that nothing could change what had already been done. The trust that had once bound us together had been shattered beyond repair, each lie another crack in the foundation of a life that could no longer hold the weight of what had happened. I had spent days trapped in the aftermath of that discovery, searching for a way to piece together the fragments of what remained. But now, as the days stretched into nights and the silence of the house grew heavier with each passing hour, I knew that the time for questions had passed. What remained now was the choice that lay before me, the decision that would shape the rest of my life. I could stay, clinging to the remnants of a marriage that had already been broken beyond repair. I could pretend that trust could be rebuilt, that the memories of her betrayal would someday fade into the background of a life rebuilt from the ashes of what had been lost. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew it wasn't possible. No matter how much I wanted to believe otherwise, the image of her with him would always be there, a shadow that would linger in every touch, every glance, every moment shared between us. Or I could leave, walking away from the life we had built together and starting over in a world where her betrayal no longer defined me. The thought was both terrifying and liberating, a leap into the unknown that offered no guarantees, only the possibility of something new. But as I stood at the crossroads of what had been and what could be, the choice became clearer with each passing moment. I couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the choices that had led us to this point. But I could choose what came next. The weight of that realization settled over me with a strange sense of calm, as if the storm that had raged within me for so long had finally begun to subside. The anger, the sorrow, the endless questions, they were still there, but their hold on me had begun to loosen, replaced by the quiet certainty that the path forward lay in letting go of what could no longer be. The life I had built with Lauren was over, not with a sudden break but with the slow unraveling of trust that had begun long before I had discovered the truth. And now, standing on the edge of what came next, I knew that the only way to move forward was to leave the past behind. That night, as the house settled into the stillness of another sleepless night, I made my decision. I packed my things in silence, each item a fragment of the life I was leaving behind. The framed photos on the nightstand, the books we had chosen together, the souvenirs from trips that now felt like memories belonging to someone else, all of it went into the suitcase with a finality that echoed through the room. By the time I finished, the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky beyond the window, casting pale streaks of light across the floor. As I stood in the doorway, suitcase in hand, I took one last look at the room that had once been a place of warmth and love. The ache in my chest hadn't lessened, but beneath it lay a sense of freedom that I hadn't known I needed until now. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with questions I couldn't yet answer. But as I stepped into the hallway and made my way toward the front door, one thought echoed through my mind with unshakable clarity: that I was ready to begin again. The morning air was crisp as I stepped outside, suitcase in hand. The sky stretched pale and cloudless above me, the faint hum of distant traffic the only sound breaking the stillness. I paused on the front steps, taking a moment to steady the pulse that still drummed beneath my skin. Behind me, the house stood silent, holding the echoes of a life that no longer belonged to me. I didn't look back. I had already spent too many nights staring at those walls, hoping to find answers in the shadows of what had been lost. But the answers never came. Every corner of that house carried a reminder of what had once been a shared laughter that no longer echoed, a warmth that had turned to cold silence. Even now, as I stood at the threshold of my departure, I could feel the weight of those memories pulling at me. But I knew that I couldn't stay. The decision to leave had not come easily. In the days after discovering Lauren's betrayal, I had wrestled with questions that offered no easy answers. How do you walk away from someone you once loved more than anything? How do you untangle yourself from a life built on shared dreams and whispered promises? For so long, I had clung to the hope that there might still be a way forward, that we could somehow rebuild what had been broken. But no matter how hard I tried to imagine a future where we could move past her betrayal, the image of her with Daniel always rose to the surface, a shadow that refused to fade. I had stood in the guest room, suitcase half-packed, and stared at the fragments of a life I could no longer call my own. Each item I placed in that suitcase felt like closing a door on a chapter that could never be rewritten. The framed photos we had once chosen together, the books whose pages we had shared, the souvenirs from trips that now felt like distant echoes, all of it carried the weight of a story that had reached its final page. And yet, as I packed those fragments away, the ache in my chest began to lessen, replaced by a strange sense of clarity. The hardest part had been standing in the doorway of our bedroom, the room where so many nights had been spent in warmth and laughter, now tainted by the knowledge of what had been lost. Lauren had been there, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of guilt and something else, something I couldn't quite name. For a moment, the air between us seemed to vibrate with the weight of all the things we had never said. But in the end, no words were spoken. There was nothing left to say. Now, standing on the front steps, I felt the finality of that moment settle over me like the closing of a book. The path that had once stretched ahead of us, filled with dreams we had woven together, had come to an end. And as painful as it was to leave behind the life we had built, I knew that holding on to what could no longer be would only prolong the ache that had taken root in my chest. That I stepped down onto the pavement, the weight of the suitcase grounding me as I moved forward. Each step carried me further from the house that had once been my home, the distance between us growing with every beat of my heart. The world outside seemed to move with a strange clarity, as if the air itself had shifted now that I had made my choice. The distant hum of traffic, the faint chirp of birds, the soft rustle of leaves beneath my feet, all of it seemed to whisper of a future that had yet to be written. As I reached the end of the driveway, I paused and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. For so long, I had carried the weight of betrayal and sorrow, allowing it to shape the way I saw the world. But now, as I stood on the edge of what came next, I felt that weight begin to lift, piece by piece. The pain of what had happened would always be a part of me, etched into the fabric of my story in a way that could never be erased. But it no longer defined me. I was more than the choices that had been made, more than the hurt that had been inflicted. And as I looked ahead to the road that stretched before me, I knew that I was ready to begin again. The sound of an approaching car drew my attention, the rumble of tires against asphalt breaking the stillness of the morning. I turned to watch as the vehicle pulled to a stop a few feet away, its driver stepping out with a casual nod of acknowledgement. The trunk popped open with a faint click, and I placed my suitcase inside, the last tangible link to the life I was leaving behind. As I slid into the passenger seat, the door closing with a soft thud, I took one final glance at the house through the window. The curtains stirred slightly in the morning breeze, the faintest movement against the glass. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow pass behind them, a glimpse of the woman I had once loved. But whether it was a trick of the light or a final farewell, I couldn't say. And perhaps it didn't matter. Some chapters are meant to end, no matter how much we might wish otherwise. As the car pulled away from the curb, the house began to fade into the distance, its silhouette growing smaller with each passing second. I watched until it disappeared from view, the last remnants of that life slipping into the horizon. And then, as the road stretched out before me, I turned my gaze forward, toward the future that awaited beyond the curve of the road. The ache in my chest had not vanished, but it no longer felt like a weight that would hold me back. It had become a reminder, a testament to the strength it had taken to walk away from what no longer served me. And as the city began to unfold beyond the windshield, its streets alive with the hum of a world moving forward, I found myself beginning to believe that perhaps I could move forward, too, because in the end, the hardest part of any goodbye is not the leaving itself, but the courage it takes to step into the unknown. And as the road carried me further from the past, I knew that this was not the end of my story. It was only the beginning of a new chapter, one that I would write on my own terms, with a heart that had learned to heal and a spirit that had found the strength to let go.